As I said yesterday, we're at this remarkable time when we think about all of you as school leaders, what we know that next to teachers, you have the most powerful impact, right, on the quality of your classrooms, on the outcomes for your students, for the children. And when we combine that with knowing how critical this time period is for young children, we have such an inspiring lift ahead of us. One of the things I want to share up front before we dive into our topics for today is for you, some of you might know this, some of you this might be new for, but one of the things that has traditionally happened when early childhood is bridged to public education is that typically, in many contexts, what we've seen is a push down of curriculum and pedagogy and the approach from public education into early childhood. This happens for a lot of reasons. We have a long history of having two very different systems, right? Those of you who are sitting in this bridge know different funding streams, different ways of preparing our workforce, different classes, different theories, different understandings of curriculum and instruction, especially assessment. It makes sense. Sometimes when we've had people in early childhood who are on our campuses, they're co-located there, but they're often physically far away, right? We don't even see each other. And sometimes principals in the past haven't had any supervisory relationship with those programs. So there's a reason why we haven't had a strong exchange of information. But here's the thing I want to share up front as a provocation, and maybe that bell hooks kind of think about what is it that we need to do in terms of love as an action. Here it is. It's not just that we've had these two systems, that it's been hard for us to connect, which is why we've seen things pushed down. It's because we have a history in early childhood of our experiences, our research, our professional body of knowledge not being recognized as professional. We can have people who are in the field for 15 years, a coach, a researcher, and we still face a context where it's not always seen and recognized with as much respect and value as our other educational pedagogies, as our other educational research, right? And this might come out in your building and your site as people saying things like, wow, I would love to go down to that TK. It must be so fun to just play all day, right? That sense of we're doing work in the upper grades and you all are just having fun as babysitters watching young children play. And I bring this up because at this powerful moment where you are going to set the tone in your buildings, in your districts, in your communities, what is your number one goal? To have that tone be, we are going to do what's right by children, what is developmentally informed, right? I want you to know part of what you're going to do is listen for things like that and disrupt them and be that model, that leader that says, no, we're learning a lot about child development, about early childhood, and what we're going to have is we're going to truly create a bridge where some of this pedagogy from early childhood pre-K is pushed up into TK, K, and even beyond, and we're going to have a true bridge and exchange of information. So in our time this morning, I'm going to weave in some ideas about and build on what I said yesterday around the importance of this critical time for children's brain and body development. We'll talk a little bit about environment, but I've noticed that's been coming up. You had a chance to hear a lot about that. So we're going to talk a little less about that so that I can focus on language and literacy development. This is a huge area, right? For principals, for school leaders. There's a lot of pressure around literacy outcomes, and so we're going to talk about what it looks like to be developmentally informed and what it means to get it right, and what are some of the consequences and opportunity costs if we allow the pressures to push down and create environments that maybe help us meet unrealistic outcomes for children, But what does that mean? What does it take away? So we'll look at that. And then depending on time, I'll want to touch on assessment, okay, because it is so different. And one of the things we know is that we can be talking about development, children's brains, developmentally informed pedagogy, and instruction and environments. We can be talking about all this stuff. You can be excited and moving towards that end. If we don't align our current assessment systems, our report cards with this, what's going to happen? Are the teachers going to teach the way we're talking about? No, right? Because the pressure is on them for those report cards for that assessment. So it is so important that we align our assessment with everything we're talking about, and that's probably one of the bigger learning edges for all of us in this room and for the state to be able to really build in a pre-K to 3 system that is aligned and developmentally informed. So what I'm going to do how I've been running these sessions is we're going to stop at different times throughout, let you talk at your tables a little bit, bubble up your questions, and then we'll move through. So we'll kind of see where the energy is and the interests are. But here's what I want. I always want to start. If we're going to connect to something, I didn't have time to do this in the keynote yesterday. We always want to ask you to reach into your lived experience, your personal experiences, to connect to what we're talking about. So I'm going to give you just a few minutes to lean into somebody at your table. If you want to join somebody, you can. If you want to stay there, that's fine too. Those of you who are at a table by yourself. But I want you to think of yourself as a TK child. Think about those preschool years, kindergarten year, and come up with a memory of your childhood play. And I want to acknowledge right up front, some of you may not have had experiences. Not everybody had an opportunity to play as a child. And we have some experiences that are not positive ones. I want to acknowledge that. But many of you will have positive memories of play. What pops up? Don't think too hard about it, just what comes to mind. And here's what I want you to share in a few minutes with your table mates. Where were you? Where was the location? Were you inside, outside? What materials were you playing with? What was the role of adults in your play? Did they have a role? What was the role of risk? Think about how much risk you were afforded in that play memory, and then any emotions that are associated with that. So go ahead and take a few minutes, and then we'll do some sharing out.
I do remember a lot of dramatic play on like the cash registers and just taking out the card and playing in mud.
Okay, I see lots of smiles, a little laughing, people leaning in and listening, attuning to each other. Let's have a few of you, let's just share out a few briefly, some of these play memories. Any brave volunteers who want to just recount a favorite memory? We'll start here.
We spent a lot of time outside.
Okay, outside.
And it was very unstructured.
Unstructured.
Very little adult either supervision or even adult teaching us how to do or play things. It was
Okay.
more peer driven, like we just knew how to play handball because
Okay.
somebody from an older person must have taught us how to do it. And we took a lot more risks.
Okay.
Because the play structures also now were a little bit more dangerous. But it was fine. Like we just like got up and
Okay. So I heard a lot of self-determined play, child agency and control, some risks that the children among themselves and with their peers, the children were assessing their risk, and that it turned out okay. 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 Thank you for sharing. And you had your hand up.
Yeah, sure. I shared with my group play that I did at home. It was a lot of independent play, and I used to love getting dirty and messy. I'm sure my mom didn't like it too much, but I would play in the mud, make mud pies, put them on myself, and just, explore roly-polies. That was just really interesting and fun for me.
I love that. And that image of the scientist exploring, you had, that observation, you were probably problem solving, developing theories about how things work, testing them out with the mud. For either of you or any of you, emotions that you associated with your play memory? It's hard to think back, but happy. And then how about you? Yes.
There's a lot of joy. I was outside, little supervision, roller skater down the hill.
Roller skater down the hill. There's some risk, okay?
All I can remember is it was all I wanted to do from the time the sun came up to the time the sun came down. And somebody used to have to remind me to go to the bathroom because then I had to take off my skates, right, and go in the house. So I had to wait forever to finally go to the bathroom because I just wanted to be outside in the sun.
You were so internally motivated. Have any of you heard of the theory of flow? Getting in the flow when you're so engaged in something, it brings that sense of spontaneous joy. There's enough of a challenge that you're really attuned and focused to it. And you sort of lose touch with hunger, with all those sort of daily needs, right? And you're saying that, like you just had to be reminded. You might need to eat, you might need to use the restroom. You were in the flow on those hills. So thank you so much for sharing and for taking time to tell those memories. I like to start here. I was the director of the Center for Play Research for many years, and we looked at research and play memories all around the world. And there are 4 themes that come up when we ask people literally in every society on earth about their most salient play memories. And what are those things that come up? And you heard them here. Oftentimes, not always, we do have some people who play alone, but oftentimes people are playing with somebody, some relationship, right? With a peer, with a cousin, sometimes with a pet. That didn't come up here. That there's some agency and control involved. That it tends to be, most of these memories tend to be on the continuum of play-based learning towards the left-hand side with the child self-determined play. So I just want you to think about that for a minute, that's what stayed with you, all these years. They tend to be outside. And that's interesting for us to think about, because one of the things about a high-quality early learning environment is that we plan indoors as intentionally as we plan the outdoor environment. And not just outdoors for recess, but outdoors taking the activities that we tend to do inside and extending them into the outdoors, right? And the last one is risk. In people's play memories that are the most joyful, that they keep with them throughout their lives, they tend to have some level of risk involved. And I want to just say this for a minute because I want us to be thinking about this with a developmentally informed environment. We tend, when we push curriculum down and push standards down that aren't developmentally informed, and we put pressure, we have pressure, and we pressure the kids, right, to get to, it's harder to take risks intellectually, isn't it? To take a risk and to learn something new is to put yourself out there, to be willing to sort of grapple, to experiment, to explore, and be willing to fail. And if we put kids in a context where they can't take as many risks, it's going to be harder to be vulnerable and to be in that space of learning. But we also outside see less risk today because of the fear of lawsuits, right? And how we've taken away children's opportunity to engage in the kinds of play that allows them to self-assess their risk. And I want to say one thing about that children, it turns out when you observe them, maybe your own, your cousins, the children in your schools, are really, really, really good at assessing their own risk levels. Children aren't going to often put themselves in a context of taking a risk where they're going to injure themselves. Peers also, and this is not just me saying it, this is backed up by research on injuries, and it's in the play-based learning book if that's helpful for you to look at. Peers also help coach children towards developmentally appropriate risks for them. And some of you talked about that. I don't know how we did it, but we were with peers. They were probably helping us know. Risk is a really important context in our learning environments. And it was interesting to hear that it came up for all of you along with that agency and self-determined play. So moving here, when we think about play, and we're talking about play-based learning being the central aspect of developmentally informed environments, I want to just bring our attention to, when we think about play, we have to think about what play is, what it's not as well. Let me ask you, what is your guess about and there's research from many years on the different studies on this, people who ask young children, TK age, K age, to say, what is the difference for you in your life, in your classroom? What is the difference between play and work? What do you think they say? Play is what? Play is fun. Okay. What else? They do say that. They do say it's fun. But there's one factor that for children, they will call us out every time and say, that's a fun activity, but that's the work from the teacher. How are they? What's that?
I have a 4-year-old. He would say like the ABC worksheets.
Okay, ABC worksheets. Okay.
Writing would be work.
Okay, that would be work. Any other ideas? Uh-huh.
Is it about choice?
It's about choice. It's about choice. Children will say, you know what? My teacher, when the researcher comes in and says, tell me a little bit about your classroom. What's happening here? And they say, well, later we get playtime. But right now it's work time because our teachers set up, we have 4 tables and they're going to ring a bell and we're going to move and we have the cards that tell us what to do. They're, even by 4 years old, they know the difference between self-determined play, right? And something where they have agency and control and something where it's adult planned and adult directed. So just looking here, think about these in relationship to your own play memories. Play is pleasurable. It requires active engagement. It could be intellectual. It could be physical in terms of activity. Intrinsically motivated. A lot of you talked about that, and this is why that agency and choice is so important. And this doesn't mean it has to only be self-determined play, because remember, guided play builds from the child's interests. So we have a lot of runway there, a lot of room to support that. It involves attention to means over ends, so we're focused on the process of learning, not just the outcome. And that's really important because that's one of the things that we have to kind of reclaim and reframe, is so much focus on the outcome has created a lot of stress for children in their classrooms. And we realized out of No Child Left Behind and those kinds of policies, we had the right aim of disaggregating data, seeing the achievement gap, wanting all children to thrive. That's the right aim. But what we saw was so much pressure on high stakes tests and pushing that down younger and younger grades, right? It created a lot of negative consequences for teachers, for children, and for families. So what are we saying now? It's the outcome, the equitable outcome, but it's equity as process too. That the journey to that outcome has to be filled with joy, no harm, support for the child, and that's what we're talking about here. So it's flexible and changing. And then this last one, a non-literal, that's for imaginary play. Okay. I'm only going to briefly touch on this because you've heard about this. We wanted to make sure you knew about this resource. But to say, when we rolled out TK in the beginning, we literally thought about it as a first year of a 2-year kindergarten. And so what happened was that the standards for assessment and for pedagogy were basically the kindergarten standards that were somewhat adjusted. And you heard people yesterday saying, we had to sweep it all out. We had to start over. And what they're talking about is saying, we're going to start by saying, what's right for 4-year-olds? What's right for a TK and a K child, right? We're not going to just take a very academic K, by the way, and across the country, you're seeing there's a movement to say, what happened to play in kindergarten? Kindergartens are looking more and more like a first grade, and they're getting play pushed out. So it's not just that we're talking about TK needing to be play-based, and it's not just here in California. All across the country, people are saying, we need to rethink K. We need to introduce joy. We need to sort of claim children's process equity, right, and experience in those classrooms. And that's the beauty of the P3 alignment, is to be able to do that for young children. But we're starting by saying these foundations is what we know are right for children, and this is what we're going to build from. Okay, so for some of you, that might be what you're already doing, and for some of you, this might be a really big lift, a really big change to introduce this to your teachers and to focus on the foundations. So yesterday we talked about neural development, and a lot of you have heard that, the importance of the first 5 years. What I didn't get a chance to say, and I just want to spend a few minutes on, is we know that there's more, the brain develops fastest in these years. We want to get it right from the beginning. Yes, there's neuroplasticity, but believe me, I'm a parent of 3 daughters. 2 of them experienced a lot of early relational loss and trauma. And to rewire the brain, I work with this every day. My daughters are now upper teens, young adults, and we're still working on rewiring those early patterns in the brain. It is much harder to rewire a brain than to get it right from the start. And one of the things that I know we know about is we think about trauma and trauma impacting brain development, but what we don't talk enough about is thinking about how everyday stressors for a child, let's say being in an environment where the outcome matters more than the process, where it's not developmentally informed and they're feeling pressure, right, to achieve, what happens to that little child? And I just want to talk for a minute about that. So you have a child in the classroom, they're being asked to hold a pencil, they're being pushed to name a letter, they're whatever you name the stressor that's not developmentally appropriate for that child. Their stress activation goes off, the stress system, and what happens then? Their body is flooded with stress chemicals. It can take up to 48 hours for those stress chemicals to release outside of the body. And what happens when that happens every day, over and over and over, right? Not only is it those stress chemicals harmful for children and their learning and development, it will impact every aspect of their development. But because the brain develops in a hierarchical manner, what happens is that lower brain stem, the part that we talked about yesterday, that's always asking the question, am I safe or am I under threat? That part of the brain gets overemphasized in brain development. We said those first 5 years you're laying down the architecture for children's brains that is going to be there the rest of their life, right? That part of the brain that we share with reptiles, that part of the brain that's about moving fast, self-protection, survival, that part of the brain gets overemphasized. And so that means that the limbic system, the part that connects and builds relationships, that establishes a sense of belonging, that is about your emotions, as well as the cortex with all those things that we need for children to learn, those parts, because the brain develops hierarchically, and the bottom part of the brain did not develop optimally, the next parts of the brain will not develop optimally. I mean, that's just real. That's just what it is. So this is why when we have a lot of stressors day after day after day for young children, we see that we have a lot of developmental delays. We have more disabilities that are associated with that. And the last thing I want to say about this is for a child who has an overactivated brainstem, these children, their brains and their bodies are telling them every day the world is not a safe place. So these are kids who you see, and I, like I said, I parent a child who went through this and still is healing from this, but she would walk into a classroom and she would be constantly scanning the environment. Am I safe? Am I under threat? She would read cues from kids. They would be, she would see children who were talking together 10 feet from her on the playground, and she would say, they're talking about me, right? She's under threat. The world's not safe. She sees danger everywhere. And we know we work with these kids. It's challenging, right, when they see the world that way. So I'm building a case for it not only is a critical time for children, but we want to help get it right. We want to help support them to build that architecture, to reduce the stress for them to feel like they're in an environment that is safe and supportive of the way that they are wired to learn. So let's take a look. You've heard about and seen this book, and you might know about the National Association for the Education of Young Children. It's the association that is the most important one for early childhood. There's many, many resources on their website, and they're available for them and your teachers and others to learn about DAP. And since your job, more than anything else, is to ensure that the classrooms are developmentally informed in your buildings, you want to know, you need to be a DAP expert, or at least enough to respect it and support it and learn about it. But let's just look at this top paragraph here. Because when I think about, this says, what is DAP? So we're talking about promoting each child's optimal learning and development, but a couple of things are here that we're going to come back to throughout the rest of my talk. It says learning, we're focused on strength-based approach. So when we're always assessing children for what they don't know, that's a very different approach than the way we take it in early childhood, which is observational-based assessment and ongoing learning for children, which looks for their strengths and their interests and builds from that. The second thing is it talks about a play-based approach that's joyful. I feel like we've been talking about that all day in every session. Engaged learning, so you're not wanting to see that quiet, compliant approach to, let's say 40 minutes on the rug in large group. That's not what DAP is. And of course, culturally, linguistically appropriate. But one of the things that DAP is built on, and this is something that is all throughout schools of education and preparation of educators, so it won't be new to you, but it is absolutely central to DAP, and that is the theory of constructivism. Is that something that's familiar to you? Constructivism? So the idea of that children have to construct their knowledge. They have to engage with materials. They have to play. They have to question. They have to talk. They have to move. They have to build, right? They have to jump, climb. They have to engage first with the hands and the body, and then abstractly and symbolically in the mind. And so you're going to see how central that is. And it's going to be one of those moments for you to say, as I'm learning to become an expert on DAP, how much are children being given the invitation through the environment, through the curriculum and instruction to construct their knowledge in peer interactions with materials with the environment? We're going to talk for just a minute, and I'm going to ask you for some input in a second about the environment. I feel like you got some beautiful pictures and ideas, the ABCs that Jackie took you through yesterday about setting up the environment. But what I want to talk about is, first of all, look, this is a picture from San Francisco. This is a TK. What do you not see here? Desks. Anything else? And of course, this is spanning out. What's that? Well, you don't see a teacher. You're right. Oh, a teacher desk. I don't see a teacher desk. Okay, good. I wanted to show you this picture because we sometimes take this for granted when talking about play-based learning, but this is a huge learning edge for a lot of schools. They've said to me, Julie, I know you talk about interest areas and children having engagement with manipulatives, but how do we fit that in if we need space for every child to have a desk or for tables with chairs for every child in the classroom? And when you heard that panel talking yesterday and they were saying we had to go through because things were based on kindergarten curriculum and kind of scoop it all out and start over, this is what they were talking about, was we had to remove, remember they even said that, Chris was talking about that, having to remove the tables and chairs. You don't see, when teachers say to me, but how are they all going to sit down at the same time? They're not. That seems like a simple thing today, or to say, but it's profound. It might be a huge learning edge for some of you. It's my experience that it is. What you see here is that the environment, first of all, we think of the environment in early childhood as a third teacher. That's part of the Reggio Emilia philosophy, and it's a big part of early childhood education. But we set up the environment, and this will make sense, you've heard us say this over and over, right? To support relationship building, to support collaboration, to support movement, and to support that constructivist approach. Children engaging, do you see the materials low? They can pull them out. They can engage and interact with the materials. There's a lot of ways that teachers support children to learn in different formats, and I want us to think about, so large group, small group, partner, and individual. Which of those would you recommend is the least developmentally informed? Large group. And why is that?
Normally teacher guided.
Okay, normally teacher guided. Does anybody else have a different answer, or is that everybody agree?
It's not as active, right?
It's not as
You
active.
are going to participate.
Okay, very good. So of those, absolutely, you're right on the money. For play-based, for constructivism, for the preschool foundations, for the way that children need to learn, large group instruction is not developmentally informed. So I'm just going to say that. And this might, again, be a little bit of a learning edge of like, uh-oh, when I walk in my TK, I see a whole lot of large group instruction. In general, I'm going to tell you a goal for you to think about as a benchmark would be you don't want to see large group instruction more than 10 and at the very most 15 minutes. And when children are in large group, they shouldn't be listening just to a teacher. We want to bring in all of those pedagogies that support children to engage. They should be doing a lot of talking, a lot of interacting. If a teacher's reading a book, the teacher should be stopping every couple of pages saying, how many of you have had an experience like this character? Or reading about dogs. What's your dog's name? Oh, you don't have a dog, you have a cat? Tell me about that. There should be engagement, conversation, questions that the teacher doesn't know the answer to, right? The image of the child is strong and capable. You want to hear their ideas, their thinking, their input on things. So you're engaged in thoughtful, meaningful conversations. If you, maybe another time for sort of orientation for large group might be introducing a class pet. You're talking about the pet. You might be, showing this around, having children either touch it or ask questions about it or engage. What do we want to learn to support our pet? But you want to see that they can be interacting with their peers, that the teacher is interacting, not talking at, right? And I'm going to be real. There's a lot of teaching out there that is about children sitting still for 40 minutes and doing abstract things like talking about the calendar for 20 and 30 minutes, right? And that's where I want you as powerful instructional leaders that are committed to setting a tone and saying we're going to push up the child development and developmental science into these grades, and I'm going to respect all of that and set the tone that this is what we're doing right by children. That's where you're going to say, here's where we are. We're at 40 minutes and our goal is 10. You're going to guide that teacher to shift their practice. Small groups, really, that is developmentally informed. You want to see lots of small group work. That tends to be 4 to 6 children. Those children might be working just with peers. Often the teacher is kind of stepping in, supporting children in their self-determined play, to maybe guiding them with a scaffolding question or a provocation to move them. So they're doing that guided play, kind of helping them go to the next step. Or they might just be observing for assessment. You'll see children at tables, you'll see children on the floor, and this is where you'll see children outside. And like I said, nature and using the outdoor classroom, we do as much intentional work with that as we do with the indoor classroom. I'm going to skip past here the interest areas, but it might be interesting for you to think about where you are with your TK teachers in terms of interest areas, what you have set up. Do you have art? Do you have mathematics and manipulatives? Do you have a science observation? Do you have a listening center? Do you have blocks? Do you have dramatic play? And dramatic play, we didn't talk about this yesterday, is a beautiful way to bring in culture and language, because it can be transformed throughout the year based on the children's interests and also what is appropriate for their families, for your school, for the community. So one of the schools I was at in Sonoma County, they had a new public transit project that was coming through the community, and the children wanted to transform their dramatic play into a train station. And they did all sorts of study about the train station. In San Joaquin County, they were talking about farming and agriculture and doing that. But I just want to say, not only is it fabulous for all the things I talked about yesterday, the symbolic development, the engagement, and so on, but it can also be a beautiful way to bring in that cultural and linguistically responsive curriculum. SEL, you'll see all throughout the room, and then of course with the supports through Rudine Sims Bishop. You've heard of her windows and mirrors, I'm sure, that you want books that are both interactive storybooks. We'll talk a lot about language and literacy in a second. You want nonfiction books. You want books you see children can just pull off and read themselves, read to their stuffed animals, read to a peer. But you want children to see themselves in the books. The mirrors, they see themselves, their lived experience, they see their families, their cultures, as well as windows to see into other contexts they're less familiar with. But let me stop, I think, yes, before we go on to language and literacy, let me just stop here. Any questions, comments, thoughts that are coming up as we think about how to structure the environment before we move into language and literacy? Does this look familiar to you? Does it feel comfortable? Do you see any big lifts for yourself? Any questions? Mm-hmm.
You said the environment is a third teacher?
Yes.
What are the first two that I'm not? Classroom teachers, one is the parent the other?
Right, thank you. That's such a good question. So when we think about, and in early childhood, we always talk about the parents know their child best. And so the parent is the first teacher. And then we have the classroom teachers, right? We think of all adults as those teachers. And then the environment being a very intentionally designed third teacher. So how do you design an environment that provokes children to want to engage as those scientists, who want to explore, to want to, so thinking about things like the loose parts versus materials that tell children there's one way to use this with one right answer, right? So you kind of set up the environment to support them to be strong and capable intellectuals. Thank you. It's a good question. Anything else? Okay, let's move into language and literacy. Okay, let's take a deep breath because this is a big area. And I'm going to say again, I think this is the area where there's the most stress and pressure on school leaders to focus on outcome. You're smiling. I don't know if you want to speak to this.
Historically, I'm a middle school and college person.
Mm-hmm.
It's all I feel like I ever get to talk about. I feel like every PD we've gone to as leaders, every PD I've been required by my district to give to teachers, even teachers who don't teach literacy, because all teachers are literacy teachers, right? Has been about this, and not in ways that help them learn how to engage children. It's about how they unpack standards so they can get kids to do a thing in a specific way.
Okay, thank you. And an important truth that you're naming and sort of holding out there for us, because that starts when we push things down into that developmentally uninformed early learning environment. And it comes, yes, go ahead. Oh, did you want to add more?
I want to ask you a question
Please do.
that you do not have to answer right now. At what point did standards stop incorporating the idea of development? Because I'm not sure that the rest of them are developmentally appropriate either as a middle school, high school person. Even still, when I talk to teachers about things that are developing, right? When middle school teachers are angry about a child's behavior, I listen to the story and usually I'm laughing because I'm just thinking that's very developed. He's 10. Like, that's developmentally appropriate. Like, that's my thought process, which drives people crazy as an administrator because then we're not having a punishment conversation, we're having a teaching conversation, right? And it shifts the conversation, but I don't have enough broad knowledge on when did we remove the idea of development from standards?
So first of all, thank you for trusting yourself to name that. When I invite all of your questions coming up here so that we can talk about them. That is a really powerful question. And I'm going to bring us back to the beginning. Remember what I said? That traditionally, we've had a world of early childhood that is based in developmental science and a world of public education that is based in domain expertise and standards tied to domains, and the two have traditionally not met. And when we have tried to braid them together, to blend them together, to bridge them together, what did I tell you all? Early childhood has been dismissed. I'm not saying any of you individually, I'm talking about on a macro level in general. It is dismissed as not a real professional base of knowledge, as not a real base of research. And in fact, sometimes the only way we can get credibility is if you think about, have any of you heard of the Heckman curve and James Heckman, who was a Nobel laureate economics professor? He's an economist. And he did a return on investment curve showing how much money you put in from the lifespan from birth on, what you get back from those dollars, and what did Heckman show? We can put the curve on the Padlet if that's helpful, because it's a beautiful visual. It shows that the younger you go in investing your public dollars, the bigger the payoff. And yet, most of the money is not going in the youngest years. But he brought attention to it. He's an economist. We have been saying this for decades. So here's the brilliance of you bringing up this question and naming and just being here to bear witness, to show your commitment, to lean in and take this on. We can change that. We can push developmental science and the expertise that early childhood as a profession brings to the table. And I'm going to tell you, you are spot on. When teachers, when administrators learn about adding that element in, they're like, this makes so much sense. It makes sense because this is the way I think about working, and being around my nephew, being around my child, being around the neighborhood kids as I just sort of think about them developmentally. It makes total sense for me to bring this into the conversation in the schools. But right now, we haven't been thinking that way. It's a more humanizing way to think. Let's look at the whole human, the whole child, and not think about this homogenous, when you're in this grade, you all should be here at this place. We have such diverse lived experiences, such diverse opportunities, we have diverse temperaments and so on, right? It makes sense. And this is one of the things about teaching and learning across that bridge. Early educators are so used to thinking about individualizing that way for children, and we can offer that. We can help folks who aren't used to thinking that way. And then, of course, you can teach us a lot, too, about your pedagogy. So thank you so much for bringing that up. Okay. I'm going to provoke you with this sentence here. Our work in developmentally informed pre-K, TK, and I would even argue K, is about filling young children with language. The vocabulary, the stories, and the sounds of language. And I'm going to make a case for that and what happens, why this is so important, and what happens when we skip past it. Okay? Because we're thinking about listening, speaking, reading, and writing, and you're going to see the beauty of a play-based approach. Children who are in your TKs who are writing paragraphs, you're not going to slow them down. They can do that. We can differentiate in a way that in many ways is more flexible than a non-play-based program. So it's not like doing play is going to bore the kids who have certain skills. Not at all. We have room for all kids, and you'll see some examples. But we're going to fill young children with the sounds of language through talk. I've been bringing this up over and over and over, that you don't want to have silent classrooms. You also don't want to have chaotic classrooms, right? I'm not talking about a din, and you're going to walk in and know what it sounds like. You're going to see kids engaged and talking, and the teacher talking in response to children, and movement. The read-alouds I touched on, we'll look at drawing and writing, and of course the key is phonological awareness. Okay, I want to stop here for just a second. When you hear about the idea of reading readiness or what it means to be ready to read, we often think of two things, right? Letters, can children identify their letters? And do they know the sounds of letters, right? And so we teach and teach and teach and push and we assess, and then they've got that and we feel good and we pass them on to kindergarten. We're all good. We're ready to read, right? And yet, here is what we know from developmental science is actually what helps children be ready to read. So we've talked about language development. We can think about that for home language as well as English. All the things that you've heard me talk about, other people talk about, that the child who can take a risk, the child who can explore with materials, who can ask a question, who can tell stories and learn that those stories can be written down, and so the beginning, the foundations of being a writer. The child who can problem solve, who can learn to get along with peers. All of the cognitive pieces are essential to becoming a reader. Sometimes we don't think about physical development. How many of you would be thinking about physical development for being ready to read? Yes, some. It's kind of all over the board. I want to give you one story, just one data point among so many that we could imagine impact a young child, their physical development impacting their ability to read. This comes from my own daughter. 2 of my daughters had a lot of relational trauma, and that impacted their early neurological development, as I shared. And one daughter was very fearful because her early trauma was about her attachment figures disappearing. So she was very fearful at all times in her preschool, in her kindergarten classroom, that the adult would disappear. So her brain was overactivated in the stress response, and it was constantly telling her to scan the environment, right? So what were her eyes doing at this time of critical brain development, laying down those neurons, those dendrites, those brain connections? I'm going to put down the microphone. Her eyes would scan right eye this way, left eye this way, and she'd be sitting at anywhere she was, and she would just be scanning, but her eyes developed like this. That was protective. Her body was doing its best job of keeping her safe. What did she discover? What did we discover when she was in kindergarten and first grade, especially first grade? If your eyes are developing like this, what do we need to read? Tracking and teaming. Her eyes had to work together to be able to focus on the text and scan, and they couldn't work together. They had developed like this. Now that's just one example. We were able to work with her. It took a lot of work. She had to retrain her eyes to be able, and it impacted her reading for the next 2 to 3 years. She was able to become a reader, but it took a lot of work. This is what I'm saying. That's one of many, many stories, right? Where her physical development, because of her early trauma, impacted her ability to read. And we see this all the time. And when the teachers were saying, we need to meet benchmark, I mean, there was so much pressure on her. And she started to say, I don't know, Mom, I can't see the words on the page. And we couldn't figure it out for a while. And then we unlocked the puzzle. Oh, okay. The retraining took several months. It was exhausting. Being a parent, it was exhausting for her. So when I said it's easy, yes, we have neuroplasticity throughout a child's life, throughout a lifespan, but it is much easier and much better for the child, for you, if we can get the brain development right from the beginning. Exposure, social emotional development, exposure to literacies home as well as English, caring, that safety, the developing of attuned, responsive relationships, and a system that supports their well-being. So what changes when we think about this being what makes a child ready to read? What changes here? From they just need to know their letters and their sounds. Yeah, we take a whole child approach, don't we? And we have to think about that whole child and not just sort of pushing those discrete skills, but to say, what does this child need as an individual child across these domains, that integrated sense of learning and development, which is what early educators are so versed in doing. This is what we're trained to do, but we have to change the narrative around reading readiness, because right now it is focused so narrowly that you may not even have time, attention, resources, focus, incentive to discover what's underneath a child's challenge, right? Because you're just focused on, do they know their letters? Do they know their sounds? So I want to provoke us to think about this, and where you hear a narrow conversation about reading readiness, to be that leader, that instructional leader that can reframe. And this, by the way, is aligned to your preschool foundations. Okay? Okay. So I want to think for a minute about when I say surround the child with language and the sounds of language, what that should look like. And then I'm going to stop and ask you to just share for a minute about, is this what you're seeing in your TKs? Or is this a learning edge for you and your teachers? So we want to see books like this, and I think, I don't know, in here, maybe it was on some of the other tables, you saw this book, right? This repeated, patterned book of Brown Bear. We all know this kind of a book. Oh, it's over there. Okay, there we go. So children are learning the rhythm, the patterns of language, and they're able to learn that pattern enough to predict and to take these books. They read them to their stuffed animals, they read them to a peer, they read them to themselves, but they're learning about you can leave off certain words and they can predict, they can add the word, they can come up with rhymes and rhythms. And if you look at little Dominic here, he's learning a lot about book knowledge. This is Go Dog Go. You know that book. It's just like the patterned brown bear. Look at how he knows to track the print. He's learning about the cover. He's learning about how to track the print. His intonation is going up and down. He's learning to retell the story. He's not yet a conventional reader, but you can see that he knows the climax of the book. He closes the book. Look at him. He says, the end. He's learning to see himself as a reader, to develop that identity, that he is a book reader. He is somebody who's literate. He can do this. That's really, really important. You see here what I talked about where children, this is the brown bear. You see the teachers have taken out some of those sentences and they put them up here, and the children have taken the book, they're pointing to the pictures, they're pointing to the sentences. Remember how I said sometimes they're at tables, sometimes they're on the floor, sometimes they're outside? And they can move, they can talk, they can engage, they're connecting. A teacher might come up and say, do you know about any of these animals? Connect it to their life. Start in a conversation, provoke. We talked about read alouds. The teacher stops, has children engaging in language. But one of the things that, we'll get to the slide in a second, we want to see more of. I heard people talk this morning about Heggerty and some curricula that support children with phonological awareness, which, as you see here, what is that? It's a broad skill that's about identifying and manipulating the sounds of oral language. This is really important, and I want to take a minute to say why. When we think about phonics, and I know there's a lot of discussion now about the science of reading and phonics and the role of phonics. It's important. Phonics is important. But what is phonics? Attaching letters to sounds, right? The relationship of letters and sounds. Children cannot do that. They cannot learn phonics and engage with phonics until they've learned to identify the different sounds in the language. We take that for granted, but that's a huge skill. They have to be able to hear the sounds. For some children developmentally, for the child I talked about earlier, part of her struggle with her learning disabilities was that she couldn't learn all the sounds, so she was having a hard time producing those sounds. She had some early intervention around that. But children have to be able to hear all the sounds, and they have to be able to play with those sounds, take them apart. This is what, in early education pedagogy, this is why rhyming, poems, alliteration, books that play with the sounds of language that allow children, like the brown bear, what do you see? I see a red horse looking at me, and the children being able to play. This is what you want to see, not just with 10 minutes and a circle time, all day long. Sounds, music, finger plays, poems, alliteration, playing. And if you have children, look at this here with this phonological awareness, doing the name hops where they're clapping. I can't do it with things here, but imagine Stacy, right? Jordan, and they're clapping and they're learning how to separate the syllables and the sounds. Now add that to movement. Imagine that those children are standing up and they're literally hopping while they're doing that and clapping. Remember what I talked about, how that's regulating for them? It's engaging for them. They're learning, they're developing their physical development, but they're also developing the phonological awareness. This is so critical, and I want to skip here. To develop phonological awareness, we don't need textbooks, we don't need dittos, we don't need any. This is the sounds of language. And that leads to phonics. I want us to look here and think together for a minute. So this, if we think about this as the tree that is, and we have the roots and the tree for reading and literacy, what do you see as the roots First of all, you can see the big red there. It says no print needed. Okay? We see two things there that are key. Letter identification and formation. And you've seen several examples, and I bet you've heard it in other breakouts. This doesn't have to be abstract symbolic teaching. Remember how I showed you Carlene, who provoked children with the sensory-based shaving cream? And the children were having fun and exploring. It was self-determined play, and then she had a provocation for guided play. Why don't we see if you can all write your first letter of your name in there, right? And so they started practicing with that. And they're building that eye-hand coordination, the hand muscles that will help them one day hold a pencil by doing that sensory-based play. So letter identification, we can do that in play-based learning in meaningful ways. Phonological awareness. Playing with sounds. So you can do your curriculum, your Haggerty's, and all of that's great, but you want to be hearing music, singing, poetry, playing with sounds all day long. And you know what? We can do this in ways that's developmentally engaging for children. Moving from transitions are hard, right? Moving from one activity to another, we can often use songs, and songs that they can predict. Down by the bay where the watermelons grow, right? You know this song? Back to my home I dare not go, for if I do, my mother will say, have you ever seen a goose kissing a down by the bay? Do you know how excited the children are going to be singing that with you as they're predicting, and then they come up with their own verses to the song? So you're helping them with the transition, you're supporting them to learn about the sounds of language, to learn about the prediction, you're giving them that agency and control. So these things can be built into the routines throughout the day. But I want to just stop here for a second and say, let's look at the roots and think about how those roots are building the opportunity for phonics, for encoding and decoding. And I often get the question, but can't we just accelerate this? Can't we just push it down? Here's a visual image. What is going to happen if we remove the language, we remove the music, the play, the phonological awareness, and we start to drill with worksheets and have just that outcome to meet the standard? What's going to happen?
The basic concept should not understand. Tree's gonna fall over.
The tree's going to fall over or struggle. We can imagine it's going to be a little bit more vulnerable, for sure. And in some cases, it might fall over. And we often identify gaps for children in second, third grade, first and all the way up, and why are they struggling to learn how to read? And we have all sorts of interventions that focus above the roots. Do you see that now? A lot of our interventions are focusing above the roots, and we're wondering, and we're so passionate. You want your children to succeed. They want to succeed. Their families desperately want them to succeed. But so often what happens is that we have taken away the opportunity for children to build those roots. That leaves gaps, and then they struggle, and we're giving them an intervention that is not addressing those gaps. Do you see how this can happen? And then we're putting stress on that child, and they start to feel like, I'm not a reader, not a writer, I don't get this. And many of you just have the heartbreak of those cycles. So, before I get to the opportunity cost slide, can we just all agree, let's just look at this worksheet. Is this helping with phonological awareness? No. Is this helping with problem solving? Cognitive development? Agency and control? The child is scientist? The child might enjoy doing these, and the parents might be really demanding for you to have these sent home and homework packets. A lot of people walk into classrooms and see children doing this. It's quiet, they're engaged, they're doing this. And this is where I want you to go, alarm bells. I'm the leader of developmentally informed instruction. They're quiet doesn't mean that they're learning. Doing worksheets certainly doesn't mean that we are giving them the roots for effective literacy. So we don't need to be doing this. It keeps them busy, but it's not really supporting anything. And this might be a big lift for a lot of folks who are used to using a lot of dittos and worksheets in early childhood. Writing makes thoughts visible. So we've talked about language being so essential, interactive book reads, music, rhymes, and things like that for reading. I want you to think about this trajectory, starting with talk, then children draw, and then they learn to write. So how do children begin that process of writing? We talked about this earlier. They need to know that they have stories to tell. This is why we want to hear from children and give them lots of opportunities in their play, in our interactive book reading, in our conversations in our large group to say, you have stories to tell, and they're so important that I'm going to document those. So let's look at an example here. Children will first, they're talking, and they'll start with this. You're going to see this in TKs. You're going to see this in pre-Ks. You'll probably even see it in some K, because again, children at that age, there's so much going on in their brains. It is developmentally normal and expected for children to be all over the map in those first 5 or 6 years in terms of their developmental progression, the rate at which they develop skills, which skills in what order, and it has to do with the rapid nature and individual nature of just how children develop. And pediatricians will tell you this, right? This is why we have to sort of think about individualizing. But you have a child who has a story to tell, and they're going to tell that story maybe orally. They might draw about it, and a teacher is going to say, I want to help this child see themselves as a writer. So I'm going to say to the child, tell me about your picture. And what does the teacher do but write down the words? And the child begins to connect. I have stories to tell, and it has something to do. There's something powerful that happens when you put these strings of letters together. What's happening there? The teacher first writes that out and reads it back, and the child can share that with family, with peers. But do you see the progression from I have stories to tell, I draw, and the teacher then dictates and writes my story for me? We want to see access to materials for children to be able to do this all through the classroom. So this is a learning edge for a lot of people. You don't want just an interest area that's just like, here's the one place you can write. When children are building with blocks, you want them to be able to pick up materials and to be able to draw a picture and have it dictated, or to begin, as you'll see, putting down random letter strings, putting down words. It's powerful for them to be able to say, look, we built the Golden Gate Bridge with the blocks, and we're going to tape that up here on our blocks to show everybody what we made. They're going to be so much more motivated to learn the letter G for Golden Gate Bridge, something they built, than something that is abstract and disconnected from their play. So we want to have things available just like this, where children can take things, they can label, they can move things around the room. Oh, can I just go back here? Do you see this teacher here? This is a TK teacher up in Shasta County. She has these all throughout the room. It says, this is the writing center. Here are some of the things that we're working on. It's not from the DRDP or the Learning Foundations, but you can see what she's doing, and she's helping the parents and the families know what's happening there, right? That children are working on letter formation, eye-hand coordination, sometimes making visible the development in play is really, really important. And this is one of the things she's doing. So here's an example. This is a younger child. This is from preschool. And I just want to keep going to this place of writing comes from stories, comes from experience. We want it to be embedded in a functionally meaningful way for children throughout the classroom. These two boys love to play with the babies, and David Santino's on the left here. And he rocked the baby to sleep, and he was concerned he was a 3-year-old, and he said, I don't want to go to circle because the baby's going to wake up, and I want to be there to support the baby when the baby wakes up. What did the teacher think? Capable, strong, the image of the child. I want to build from the child's interests, and I want to make literacy meaningful to this child. She said, you know what? Santino, he went by his last name Santino. She said, Santino, let's use a saving card. He's 3. It was the first time he had tried to write his name at school. But do you see here? She wrote his name, and he starts to do a random letter there for his D. Do you know how motivated he is now to learn how to write his name for a saving card so he can be there for the baby? These children are putting together a welcome sign for people to come to their school. If you look closely, you can see children who are writing, they have scribble letters, they have just beginning letters, some who are doing full developmental spelling. So you can see here, it's meaningful. They're welcoming parents and families for this event that's coming to their school. And there's room for children at all the different literacy levels, and they're highly motivated to do this. It's coming intrinsically from their interests. We're going to look at, in a second, I'm going to show you the different stages you're going to see in your TK, in your K. Here's a message center. This TK teacher puts these throughout the room. Like I said, making things visible and available. The children, first of all, they love to write messages to each other sometimes, but they have messages here, just, I like doggies, right? Well, somebody else says, well, I have dogs. It's motivating. They start communicating to one another. And here, this was one last example I wanted to share. There's so many, but I just want to give you that sense of literacy comes from, it should be embedded in children learning that they can be writers, they can be readers, and it's attached to things that are meaningful to them. So this was a teacher, a TK teacher, very far north, near the border, and she said, a lot of children were coming to me, and they were saying that they were having all sorts of conflicts with their peers. She said, we're working a lot on social emotional, but I wanted to tie it to literacy. So she said, the children, she said, why don't we write letters or notes about it? You can tell me about your problem, you can draw it, that's where you are, and I can dictate for you. I want your name and I want an understanding of the problem. And the children said, let's call it the tattle box. So they named it. Let's look at this. I want you to think about what happens when you offer this kind of opportunity for literacy all throughout the day for children. So we've got James. He says, well, Carson cannot share with me. Now, what is the teacher doing? She's gathering James and Carson together. They're talking. There might be other peers there. They're using this as an opportunity to build social emotional learning, right? Well, Carson says, James said, I can't play. So now we both have a perspective. We're both going to be part of this, and we're communicating through our language and through our writing. Trevor pushed me. Carson wasn't sharing. The boys, they were touching the things. Look at how hard Evo's working here. And do you see the different developmental levels in this TK for the literacy? And then this final one, Kylie says, Oliver, throw to block, and Carson has something to say about Kiara's language here. So the beauty is, do you see this is capturing the children as readers and writers. It's meaningful, it's embedded in their curriculum. They're engaged, and here's what's going to happen. When somebody a friend looks at Eva's, it's going to naturally scaffold children to go to that next level. They're going to be so motivated to learn about the literacy that you're going to see a lot of development through these stages. So we're going to start, I said we start with talking, then we dictate, right? When children start to put, and remember I talked about how important it is that they have all that fine motor and muscle development. Scribbles imitating writing, letter-like forms, moves into random letters, representing sounds with letters, approximating conventional spelling, and conventional spelling. All of these things you're going to see in a TK. And all of that is normal, and all of that is good. And you're going to push the child from where, not push, you're going to engage the child from where they are to that next level, but so are their peers, and so is play. This is why we talk about play, and I brought this up. Play is a natural scaffold because children act, remember I said a head taller than themselves, they expand what they can do through the play frame more than what they could do if you put them at a table and said, we're going to do this worksheet and learn about these things. So I come here to this slide, and I just want to stop here for a minute, go through this and hear your thoughts. Can we accelerate literacy to meet those benchmarks, to make sure that we're check on the outcome? make sure every child is there? Of course we can. And I don't want to put this as we're either meeting outcomes or we're meeting children's learning. I don't mean to bifurcate it. We want those outcomes. We talked about that, equitable outcomes, but remember, it's equitable process to get to those outcomes. So thinking about that image of the tree I showed you, if we push children towards that narrow definition of readiness to read, and we drill and drill and drill to meet that benchmark of identifying the letters and the letter sounds, and they haven't had, what are we giving up? Oral language opportunities, experiential. Dominic's not going to be able to read that book over and over. We're not going to have opportunities for children to write at the message center what's going on for them and to build those beautiful social emotional skills with their peers. And you're not going to build the phonological awareness, which is needed for phonics. So what I'm saying here is of course you can push children past in a developmentally inappropriate way to meet certain outcomes and benchmarks, but at huge opportunity costs, and like I said, it leaves them with gaps that we then see and really struggle to deal with later. So I want to stop. We have just a few minutes here, but just to see what's top of heart, what's top of mind, what's bubbling up for you. Let's hear some of your reflections to what we just talked through.
I really like the piece about making writing available to them at the level that the child is at
Yes.
in various locations throughout the room, and the messaging to one another.
Yes.
I think that's great, right? Because it gets them to, at least at the very beginning, at least to the early stage of writing, which is the picture,
Yes.
right? And
Yes.
I love that other example that you have of the adult actually writing what they said, as opposed to in full detail, right? Because they tell you this long story. It looks like a picture that doesn't make any sense, but the child is telling you a story, and typically because they're younger, we want to go with like, I like dogs. It's like, no, I
Right.
like dogs because my dog's name is whatever.
That's right.
I like that piece of really being able to tell the kids' full story.
Thank you for saying that and for going back and revisiting that, because when we take their full story with all that rich vocabulary and lived experience and we turn it into I like dogs, remember where I started yesterday? The child needs to feel seen and heard and validated. And when you come home and you tell me about your long day at work with all the complexities, and I respond back to you as a partner with something equivalent of I like dogs, you're like, you aren't listening to me. That doesn't feel good, right? And we're taking away the opportunity for children to feel like they are storytellers, they have something to say, and that we see them, that they belong, that we value all of what they said. And think about the vocabulary development in that bigger story, right? Versus I like dogs. So thank you for saying that. I think we need to stop here. That went fast. But I'm going to tell you a few things that we didn't get to that will be available to you. At the very end of my deck here, I show you a picture of a walkthrough tool that is in the back of the book that you received yesterday, the principal book. There's a link to a walkthrough tool that just helps you. It has a section on what you want to see teachers doing, what you want to see children doing, and what you want to see in the environment. And it will all feel familiar based on what you're learning here over the 2 days. You'll also see I put up an example of a walkthrough tool that Kern County put together for their UTK. And just in the essence of sharing across counties, we'll have that. And then, of course, LA County, you have a beautiful checklist that will be available as a walkthrough tool. I'll stay here. I know you have a break. I want you to have your break. But if anything I've said here would be helpful to connect with, just know that I have my email. I'm happy to share any resources with you, to touch base with you. And thank you so much for coming.